Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Curt Smith, baseball is the quintessential American sport. So which president was the first to see the importance of its profile in national life?
I think probably William Howard Taft in 1910, all 300 pounds of him, throwing out the first ball and inaugurating the right of throwing out the first ball to begin every baseball season. But you know, the game itself goes back to before there was a republic, when we had a skirmish between, as I recall, the Brits and the Americans. General Washington at Valley Forge threw the ball back and forth for hours with his aide-de-camp. A game of rounders, the British antecedent of baseball. Abraham Lincoln playing town ball outside of the White House and bringing the game inside. He actually played baseball in the corridors, using the corridors as base paths. But I think William Howard Taft really was the first, and since then, and I have a chapter on every president since then, up through and including Donald Trump, we have a chapter showing the president's relationship to the game, to the culture and the presidency's relation to him.
It's completely fascinating, and you reveal in your book that Teddy Roosevelt didn't really like baseball, but FDR saved the game during World War II. What did he do?
Well, Franklin Roosevelt saved it after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 41, and baseball was clueless, which is not necessarily an exception. So Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner, wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt saying, what shall we do? Shall we fold our tent? Shall we go home? Shall we operate during the duration of the war? And the very next day, January 15th of 42, Roosevelt held a press conference. And he read the contents of his letter aloud, which I think exemplifies the importance of baseball to the nation. And he said not simply, do I want baseball to go forth, but baseball will go forth because of its importance on the morale of the home front and of the troops abroad.
Well, and speaking of morale, George W. Bush gave that opening pitch at the Yankees game after 9/11. How symbolic was that moment?
How symbolic is anything possible to be? He did a heroic act. It was the most heroic he ever became before or since. It was a stunning act. It was quintessentially presidential, quintessentially American. That was 6 weeks after, in fact, 9/11. And the trauma and the cry for simple justice rifled through Yankee Stadium and through every television set of every American watching that event. So Bush goes to the mound, to the rubber of the mound, not in front of the mound, which is far more difficult, and he throws a perfect strike. He could not have placed that ball more lovingly in the catcher's mitt had he walked it up and placed it in the mitt. And the crowd's noise, which electrified Yankee Stadium upon that act, must have been heard in Jersey City, which is about 20 to 30 miles away. It was a stunning act, and I think next to Roosevelt saving baseball, the most presidential act which exemplifies the twinning of the heart between baseball and the presidency of the United States.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello and Happy New Year, everybody. My name is Tim Hanlon, and if you don't know by now, this is Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us. Know how difficult the challenge can be with literally millions of podcast choices available to you. And I hope to enable your new year to continue with hope and opportunity and positivism as we go back this week into hot stove mode, talk about a little bit of baseball, and had a wonderful conversation before the holidays with an author I've been seeking out for some time. And for those who have been interested in our conversations around sports and broadcasting, in particular baseball and broadcasting, a number of conversations around those topics. You will probably know the name of Curt Smith, our guest this week. Among a trove of books that explore the intersection between baseball and broadcasting, as well as baseball and politics and other books. There is one book that stands out. It's been on my shelf in tattered form for decades now. And most who have been interested in either of these topics, baseball and broadcasting, will know this book probably by heart almost, and probably have sought it out as a reference and a reread on numerous occasions as well. It's called Voices of the Game. It's the acclaimed chronicle of baseball, radio, and television broadcasting that Curt wrote. I want to say he originally put this out in the late 1980s, perhaps, maybe mid 1980s. And there was a revised version that came out in January of 1992 in paperback version, with a little bit of updates and stuff. But it is literally the seminal work around this overlap, this connection between baseball and broadcasting. As you've heard in our various conversations that have talked about those two topics together, both with people currently or previously in the chair themselves behind the mic, or those who have written books about people in those chairs. You will know and remember that most of those broadcasters, to a person, either relished or wished they had been calling baseball at some point in their careers. In that, the uniqueness of the sport, right? Probably no more of a undefined, time-defying kind of broadcast environment, rife with space and gaps and opportunities to unwind a bit, be a little bit more informal, banter, conversational stuff, storytelling for sure. And baseball has been part of the narrative history of sports generally, and perhaps maybe the prime among them, given the opportunity for creativity to really come into the sports broadcast. Maybe not so much available in some of these other more time-constrained sports of today. But we get into that with our conversation with Curt Smith, this sort of intersection, this interplay between broadcasting and the sport of baseball, and some of the most memorable names that brought that sport, both from the earliest radio broadcasts all the way to some of the most modern day television broadcasts. We'll talk about, I'll speculate a little bit about where it's going to go from today's television into whatever digital and streaming video and all those kinds of things might go. But we also talk about, as you heard in our little setup there, the intersection between baseball and politics, baseball and elected officials, and the presidency in particular has always been connoted with baseball, with the sort of historical throwing out of the first pitch of the first game of a first season for a team, or potentially annually. It's always been a long time modern day expression of the national fabric, both in terms of political unity and American spirit, as well as the sport of baseball, known as, of course, as America's pastime, but also other times too, memorable moments. For example, like George W. Bush's throwing out of the first pitch during one of the World Series games in 2001, just on the heels of a few weeks of the tragedies of 9/11. Just the connection between political whims and the presidency and the sport of baseball is also very tight. And we talk about that as well with Curt in our conversation coming up. And that book is worth getting, and also arguably is the excuse for why we're getting to talk to him now. The reissue of his other seminal book called The Presidents and the Pastime, The History of Baseball in the White House, was just issued in late fall of 2024. And that paperback version has been put out by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. Just two of the many, many books that Curt has authored around various elements of baseball and sports and broadcasting and those kinds of things. You can find them, the tomes that Curt has put out over the years, at his website at curtsmithauthor.com. That's Curt with a C, Curt Smith, C-U-R-T, Smith. Curtsmithauthor.com. And lots of great stuff. There's just an amazing amount of stuff in his catalog. And of course, you can go to our website at Good Seats Still Available. Just search up this episode numbered, what is it now? 377 with Curt Smith, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to some of those books. And of course, we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love from our friends at Amazon when you do that. Help us keep our lights on. And another log on the fire for the hot stove to keep going until March when the games start again in baseball. So, all right, let's get right to it, shall we? Wonderful conversation with the magnanimous and erudite Curt Smith. Let's talk about some baseball and broadcasting and politics and all that kind of stuff. Here's our conversation we had just before the holidays. Please, as always, enjoy. So I think our audience is familiar with some of your work, but I don't think they're familiar with what your proverbial day job was and maybe the story that led you into getting into this stuff. So how about a little background about that and then how the baseball thing comes onto your radar?
Well, I was brought up in upstate New York in a small town, sort of like Mayberry without the accent. And it was a wonderful place and culture in which to grow up. But the downside was that there was no major league team in Toronto at that time, a baseball team. And so the nearest club was in New York City, which was about 7 hours away, which meant that if I were to follow my favorite sport, and certainly the national pastime, at least at that time in the 1950s and the 1960s, I had to do it. I had the privilege of doing it by following baseball on radio and television. And this is an experience that was familiar not simply to me, but I think to almost any baby boom boy, and I suppose many girls at the time as well. We love baseball. I mean, I remember talking to Bob Costas, the great NBC broadcaster, at later in life, and you know, asking each other what baseball meant to us at that time, and each of us said basically simultaneously, it meant everything. It truly did, in a way that is difficult to verbalize, I think, today. So it was a treat to follow by radio. I was lucky to grow up in the Northeast. At that time, there were 16 and then 20 major league teams, and on a clear night, if the sky was friendly to me, I was able to follow, probably pick up on radio 2/3 of the actual games, and in many cases actually listening to the radio voices of both teams. I would go back and forth, and so it was a wonderful treat for me, and a wonderful way that doesn't really exist anymore to follow the national pastime. And on the weekend, I was truly blessed because count 'em, ABC did a game of the week on Saturday, and then NBC and CBS did a game of the week on Saturday and Sunday. 5 games a week, and CBS had an enormous advantage. Its play-by-play voice was the theatrical and the truly beloved coast-to-coast Dizzy Dean. And I think Dean showed a truism of radio and TV. It should always mean conversation. Bob Costas, again, said once, tell me about the guy sitting down at the end of the dugout. Does he come from some tiny town in Arkansas? Is he a character? Well, Dizzy Dean was a character. Tell a story, make us laugh. At worst, keep us from turning the dial. Make baseball required viewing. And he did. And the ratings for the CBS television game of the week were titanic in a way that does not exist today. A national series at that time. This was the first game of the week ever broadcast on television. But a national series needed something special to make Boise, Idaho say, watch Boston, Detroit. Well, this is where Dean came in. A mythologizing bubble of Americana, that's what critic Ron Powers called him, who would keep you tuning in even if he did the play-by-play for ballroom dancing and Arthur Murray. and he was beloved and larger than the game itself. He drubbed ABC and NBC's ratings, and each week he would sing the Wabash Cannonball, a song Roy Acuff said seemed to please and thrill him. Dean had the cowboy boots and the string tie and the Stetson. He seemed the whole rustic goods, and he had a wonderful way of absolutely devastating the English language. He would say, for example, a batter swang, a runner slud, fielders return to their respectable positions. My own favorite was Dean saying, that batter, he's standing confidentially at the plate. Dean said once, sin stacks, are those jokers up in Washington putting a tax on that too? Even I remember Charles Schulz, the famed Peanuts comic strip creator. One of his strips showed Lucy quoting Dean about an outside pitch. He shouldn't have hadn't ought to swang. Once the station offered Dean a classical music gig. You want me to play this sympathetic, meaning of course symphonic, music, and pronounce them composer names, said Dean. He confessed that he couldn't even pronounce some teams' infield. So this was Dizzy Dean, calling everyone Padna, his name for everyone in the universe. You ain't just a woofin', he would say. And I think this showed, in my case, and really for millions of other people, how you could fall in love with the game, meaning baseball, through the people who telecast and also presented it on radio. And I'm not sure that exists today. I don't believe it does to nearly the extent that it did today, did back then, because so many things have changed, not least of all the culture.
Well, for you, right? So, how much of that growing up, and I can attest. I'm a little bit younger than you are, but still the AM radio in the middle of the night thing under the covers and the
that's exactly right.
Yeah, growing up in the New York area, the seemingly far off areas like Charlotte and Fort Wayne and Chicago and all these places, some of which had baseball. How much of that, though, for you was baseball, right? And how much of that was just the dulcet tones of some interesting characters on the radio calling games, right?
I think they became synonymous. I mean, I couldn't tell when one ended and the other took off. And I think that so many broadcasters today who really are clueless, I think, about how to broadcast the game itself. They will try to absolutely obsess on statistics. Vin Scully, who of course, as we all know, was the best there ever was when it came to broadcasting baseball. He once rhapsodized that today too many announcers use statistics the way a drunk uses lamppost for support, not illumination. And as usual, Scully said it best. Baseball is not statistics. It is part statistics. It is not the whole, though, of the game. And I think today so many broadcasters, instead of the poetry of language, instead of understanding the music of the game, instead of understanding what it means culturally to America, instead of telling one story after another and make stories really tell the tale. Incidentally, Ronald Reagan, let me interject here, Ronald Reagan, who of course began his career as a baseball broadcaster, once said that, and he was talking about a speech, but it could be in terms of a broadcasting of a baseball or any other sport. He said, Reagan told me once, he said, you can tell in a given speech, you can tell an audience 15 facts and one story. And if the story is told well, it's the story you remember. And I've never forgotten that because it applies so beautifully to baseball as well. The game is slow enough that there is time for stories, and there is a necessity for them, because one statistic after another will put an audience to sleep so quickly that the only question is, do they fall asleep first, or do they turn the dial?
All right. Before we get out into the beginnings of your career, I want to know: are there any Are there any voices in particular or any teams or stations in particular that you remember growing up when you were beginning to be fascinated by this thing over the airwaves in the middle of the night that you remember that stand out, or people might not even remember today, that made an impression on you?
Well, yes, WLW in Cincinnati. I believe those are the call letters.
Yes, indeed.
That's right. It was 500,000 watts when it first went on the air in the 1930s. There was no FCC mandate or limitation on how booming a station could be. I was lucky. My station in Rochester, New York, wasn't 500,000 watts, but it was 50,000 watts, and it advertised itself as a clear channel radio station. In fact, when I became friendly with Mel Allen in his later years, and he became a dear friend, the great voice of the New York Yankees and really the voice of baseball for probably a quarter century, he told me when he learned I was from Rochester that as he went across the country, people would tell him they listened to Yankee games, and they listened to them on WHAM. And in Rochester, and this shows how you can build a national cult, a national following over radio just as easily as you could over television. But yes, there were 50,000 watt stations in WJR in Detroit, for example. I remember very clearly listening to Ernie Harwell across Lake Erie over WJR because it was so powerful. WCFL, the 50,000 watt giant in Chicago. I listened to the White Sox. WGN. I listened to the Cubs over Chicago's other 50,000 watt station. So these behemoths of wattage and their ability to reach kids growing up literally time zones away, I don't think that you could overstate how instrumental they were in making baseball truly a pastime that was national.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it is definitely, sadly, sort of becoming more nostalgic than it is generational, right? It just the way the landscape has changed and evolved over time. But yeah, it does make an impression, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, and there's no question. And I've talked to dozens of baseball announcers over the years, and they're unanimous in their belief that radio was the perfect baseball medium, and baseball was the perfect radio sport. And that simply doesn't exist today. First of all, kids don't follow radio as they once did. They don't follow baseball as they once did. And I have to think that there is some relationship between those two facts.
All right, so those seeds were planted early on, but your real world life in terms of job and all that kind of stuff took you into the realm of speechwriting and politics and that kind of stuff. How does baseball stick with you? Tell us a little bit about that first, and then how baseball sort of, I guess, I don't know, continues to gnaw at you, I guess, as something beyond what you're doing for your day job and stuff, and ultimately the font of books that ultimately come afterwards, right? So there's a lot to unpack there, but what's the career thing, and how does baseball come back into your life?
As long as I can remember, my twin loves in life have been politics and baseball, and I think that they are quite parallel and have many similarities. I think that they're both competitive. I think that they both demand a sense of strategy. I think that they are both uniquely American in the sense that we know politics and sports today. I think that they're easy to follow by radio, by television, by print, as I did when I was growing up. And this is how I became involved with my two loves. And they've remained with me to this day. I'm probably not as well-balanced a person in terms of other interests as are some, although I do love music, particularly rock music, since I was brought up on it, classic music today. But I think that radio and television, and particularly sports and politics, I think of them all the same. And they're the first things that I read about and follow to this day in any given day. So that I can't imagine not being involved with them. And the first election that I can remember was a pretty good one. It was 1960. Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, two great foreign policy presidents and two fascinating individuals opposed one another for the presidency. And I was 8 years old at the time. And I became absolutely transfixed by that election, as I already was by baseball. And I've retained those two great interests to this day. And I'm not alone in that. It's fascinating to me how many politicians have grew up as I did with baseball and have followed it to this day. Nixon was one. Jack Kemp was another. Ronald Reagan obviously was another, and there are many beyond that. And so this experience is not indigenous just to me. I think it's rather universal in terms, at least among American males. I won't purport to speak for the female half of America, but I can say that and this has been true with me. Bob Costas, another who became a friend. Politics and baseball. These are the two things that you talk about at a bar, you talk about at a restaurant, you talk about when you're getting together with the guys. That was true when I was growing up, and it's true today.
But you were kind of in the journalism / writing realm. That's kind of what your adjunct into that world was, right?
My mother was a librarian, which meant that by default I grew to love books. I think I would have in any event, but I certainly did through her. And I read vociferously when I was growing up, and I think that this led to my interest in politics because I read about it so universally in my childhood, and as a result, I had a political bent, if you would, and this led to my writing about politics later in a rather intriguing way. I grew up, as I said earlier, in upstate New York. Went to school there, then did what I knew I would, and that would do at some point in my life, and that is after beginning my career with the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, which was then Gannett, the Gannett Corporation's flagship paper. I became senior editor of the Saturday Evening Post, and from that led into politics because the Post was a rapidly Republican magazine, and I got to meet certain people in the Republican Party, not least of whom was John B. Connally, the former governor of Texas, former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of the Navy, and in 1980 he had become a Republican since then. He'd been a Democrat in Texas, of course, and he became a candidate for president, and I was named his major speechwriter. And Connally was a fascinating person to write for, and a wonder to write for, because unlike some people, he would actually make your written text even better when he gave it. Some people will actually make your text perhaps less lively than it otherwise would have been. But I wrote for Connally, and when he lost to Ronald Reagan, who didn't lose to Ronald Reagan, correct? This was the Republican contest for president, and I then became. I was named as a writer in Ronald Reagan's administration, and I wrote for 3 different cabinet secretaries, and as a speechwriter. And I had never really been a speechwriter, so I learned quickly on the job, I hope, or at least well enough to keep my position. And so all during the 1980s, from 1982 through 1988, I was a speechwriter in the Reagan administration, as I mentioned, for several cabinet secretaries. Then, in 1988, I became involved with the Bush campaign. This is George Herbert Walker Bush. And had been tapped by Reagan in 1988 as vice president. So in 1988, I became involved in his campaign. He ran against Michael Dukakis. Memory will tell us for the presidency. Bush won, and in January of 1989, I interviewed, along with I'm sure many others, for positions as a speechwriter to the president. And I interviewed, talked to him. He had read, interestingly enough, Voices of the Game, which is the book I had written on baseball broadcasting in 1987.
Oh, you had written, okay, so that's what I wanted to get to. You had written Voices of the Game in 1987 when you were essentially still, quote unquote, a journalist, right?
That's right. In 1988, I interviewed with him, and I guess it was January 1989, and I was accepted. And so I became one of 5 speechwriters to a newly elected President George H.W. Bush. Incidentally, the number 5 is interesting because Richard Nixon is the first president who really utilized speechwriting as it is structured today in the White House, and he had 5 speechwriters. And ever since then, 5 has been the magic number. Every president, by and large, has had 5 writers. And so I interviewed with Bush, and the first thing he said was that he had read Voices of the Game, which was the book on baseball broadcasting that I had written several years before. And so this is how I began my 15-year association with Bush. And I enjoyed every bit.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. So is it fair to say that in some respects, many respects really, that baseball was never too far away from your quote-unquote day job career, right? In some respects, baseball maybe got you the job.
Well, in part, I think it did, although I think having written for Connolly and certainly having written for Reagan perhaps were more important. But it certainly didn't hurt. And Bush, I mentioned earlier, people who have who have loved both politics and baseball. And Bush really should be at the top of that list because he had been a wonderful player in college at Yale. And he had played first base like his idol, Lou Gehrig. He had loved Gehrig when he was growing up. Gehrig was his hero. And so we had a great deal to talk about in terms of baseball. Baseball, it turned out, was one of a number of interests that thankfully both of us had. And he like me, was a Boston Red Sox fan. He was born, of course, in New England. And I became a Red Sox fan because my mother was born in Worcester, Mass., which is 40 miles west of Boston. So I inherited her Red Sox bloodline. Working with Bush, yes, you're absolutely right. Baseball is part of my career, even as I was writing first for Reagan and then for Bush as well. Reagan, of course, was also like baseball. He had been, as I had mentioned earlier, one of the first people to employ baseball on radio. He had done it in the 1930s and was very good at it. He was particularly good at recreations, which is an art form that young people today won't even recognize the term. It was very expensive to have people travel with a baseball team on the road, and so the question then becomes, well, how do you broadcast a baseball team if you can't be there on the spot? And the answer became recreation. Someone at the park would send a very skeletal information, balls and strikes, that kind of thing, to the actual station where the broadcaster was situated. It might be hundreds, even thousands of miles away from the actual site of the game, and so hundreds of miles away from the game, this lone person would sit next to the teletype machine, and he would get the information skeletal. For example, B1. Oh, what does that mean? Ball one outside. That's all that the broadcaster, hundreds of miles away, would get. And so then he had to use his imagination and use the language to create a world which in many ways was actually more exciting than the game itself. And if you were good enough and dramatic enough, and if you knew the game enough, you could convince even a baseball fan that you were actually at the game. That's how good they were.
Yeah, and arguably that may be some of the seeds of why and how baseball became so perhaps the most literate, if you will, and needing of expansionary discussion and storytelling and that kind of stuff as it became
absolutely
more live broadcasted, right?
There's no question about that. In fact, Reagan's first brush with the magic of play-by-play from hundreds of miles away came one day when the wire broke. Now, three teams. He was broadcasting the Chicago Cubs from a station in Des Moines, Iowa. They were carrying the Cubbies, and so Reagan asked himself, he couldn't say, since there were three stations in Des Moines doing the game simultaneously, the other stations were doing the game live. Only Reagan's station was doing the game by teletype, by recreation. So Reagan Reagan said to himself, "What do I do now? The wire's broken. I can't say we will now return to the station for transcribed music, because if I do that, listeners will tune to the other two stations in Des Moines carrying the game live." So the game came to him as in a vision, he told me once, and that is that he started inventing action. And he said to himself, what's the one thing that doesn't get in the box score? And the answer came to himself, foul balls. So for the next 7 to 8 minutes, Ronald Reagan set a world record, I'm sure, for a number of foul balls. He had the batter foul to the left, foul to the right, foul out of the ballpark. he had a storm occur. That didn't really happen, but the listener didn't know. He had a fight break out on the field. He had a pitcher ad nauseum create situations where he would call time, all of this sort of thing. And finally, after about, as I said, 7 to 8 minutes of this spontaneous play-by-play, the teletype was restored, and it came to Reagan, and he started laughing, and he said, and the teletype said, "Batter popped out on first pitch." That's all that had happened. All of the rest was strictly miscellany, but the person listening at home was none the wiser for how masterful Reagan had been.
All right, so let me back up for a second, because we went over the Voices of the Game thing came out in the late 80s.
Yes,
and
1987.
Right. So what was the impetus to writing that? This is obviously, I guess, amidst your. Obviously, it wasn't just about sort of the presidential kind of overlap with stuff, which is
right.
Your relatively current book. But what was the impetus for creating that book? And you mentioned it sort of earlier. There really wasn't a book of this kind prior. What kind of was the itch that you needed to scratch by putting this tome out, which is still, obviously still revered today?
Well, it helped that no one had done so before, so it was relatively easy to interest publishers in a book. If something doesn't exist, accept the interest. You're ahead of the curve really at the beginning of your pursuit of a publisher. This was my third book. My first book I had done when I was, how old? 20, 24, 25. And it was biography of Dizzy Dean. And really no one had done so at the time. And so I did a book on Dean. The second was a book called, my next book was a book called Long Time Gone, which was a book that recalled my time in college. I had been a member of the class of 1973, and my freshman year was the year of Kent State and Jackson State, and all of the trials and tribulations and divisions and schisms associated with the Vietnam War. And so what I did was I went around the country and I talked to people who had been the newsmakers, the news setters, prominent in the national news during my time in college. I talked to Richard Nixon in person at his office in New York. I talked to Ronald Reagan in Washington. I talked to Betty Friedan, Julian Bond, any of a number of people who were well known then and well known when I wrote the book in the early 1980s. And I still that book, because it touched a time that was very special to me. The book is very special to me. And so the Dean book was first, then came Long Time Gone, and then you asked what the impetus was in the 1980s when I was a speechwriter to do a book on baseball broadcasting. I guess because no one had ever done it, but more to the point because I was ready to write another book. So what would I write about? And this was the answer was easy. Writing the book was not easy, but the answer was easy. I told myself, what no one had done, and that is tell a history, an anecdotal history, with the characters and the headliners, the broadcasters of my youth, and that's what I did.
And what were some of the names and the legacies that you sort of were most struck by, but as you were doing that book? Obviously, there are the ones that are probably the go-tos, like this. Well, the Scully was still very much going, but the Mel Allens in the early days. But were there any sort of names of people and careers that maybe that you discovered, and frankly, maybe even today would kind of suggest to people of a certain age to go back and look up because they've been largely forgotten or not remembered very well?
Well, I think maybe the two that people would overlook and that are not remembered as much. One was Jim Woods, the great voice of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and another would be Byram Saam, a voice of the Philadelphia Phillies, who was famous for his malaprops. The first words that Byram Saam ever uttered as a big league broadcaster were, "Hello, Byram Saam. This is everybody speaking." He was a master of the malaprop, but equally beloved. And I think some of the other announcers, if I can alphabetically just say ones that come to mind.
Sure.
Mel Allen, of course, Richie Ashburn, Red Barber, Bud Blattner, Lou Boudreau, Jack Brickhouse, Jack Buck, Harry Carey, who would say of a home run, it could be, it might be, it is. And I think if someone were to ask me, who is the broadcaster that most loved baseball? Carey might be that person. Ken Coleman, Bob Costas, I talked to him. Jimmy Dudley, Dick Enberg, Earl Gillespie, Kurt Gowdy, Milo Hamilton, Merle Harmon, Ernie Harwell, really just a prince of a man and one of the great broadcasters of all time. Ned Martin of the Boston Red Sox, someone who was enormously underrated because he was one of the great broadcasters that I ever heard. Lindsey Nelson, who had one of the great voices, I think, of anyone. Bob Prince, who invented the term "how sweet it is," and whenever a pirate rally or would ensure victory, he would say, "We had them all the way." Pee-wee Reese, Ray Scott, who had another great voice, and people will remember him perhaps from football, but he was equally good as a baseball broadcaster. Vin Scully, as I said earlier, simply the best there ever was. I can't imagine how anyone would telecast or do a game on radio better than Scully. In fact, I probably have asked in the ensuing years, since I began Voices of the Game, probably have asked 100 big league broadcasters, the best baseball broadcaster of all time. Each one of them said Scully. In fact, they looked at me, some of them, as if I should be committed simply for asking the questions. Chuck Thompson, John Miller of the Baltimore Orioles at the time said of Chuck Thompson, had a wonderful voice. He said, "I don't care what Chuck says, as long as Chuck says it." Bob Wolf and the late Jim Wood. See, these are some of the broadcasters that I think come to mind because they were in the book. Obviously, since then, other broadcasters have done the game and done it well, but that is still in my book the Hall of Fame edition of broadcasters. I think baseball broadcasting was better then, by and large, more individualistic. You were encouraged to be your own person. You didn't think that you had to statistic your way through a game. You told stories. You made it come alive, and we have less of that today. And I think baseball is lesser because of it.
So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there any folks today that, and I don't know how much of a fan you are today. I suspect that you still follow the sport and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Are there any broadcasters out there now in baseball or in sports generally that you think maybe are keepers of the flame, so to speak? That I wouldn't say are old school per se, but maybe bring sort of those old school skills sort of in a modern and effective way still, and do it quote unquote right in terms of storytelling and laying picture and that kind of stuff. Are there any that sort of would be on that mantle?
Joe Castiglione of the Boston Red Sox. This year he was named the Ford C. Frick Award by the Baseball Hall of Fame. Every year since 1978, a broadcaster has been named by the Hall. It's basically their rendition of the Hall of Fame. They don't call it that, but it really is. That is, if you win a Frick, you're a member of the Hall of Fame. Not officially, but everyone thinks of people as that. And I think that I'm just trying to think of the different teams today. Certainly Gary Cohen of the New York Mets comes to mind. John Sterling, who retired last year.
Yes, former guest on this show. Yes, we've talked to him.
Yeah, well, he's Sterling. I mean,
he's terrific.
Here I am praising the voice of the arch rival New York Yankees, but he retired this year, but he is a wonderful broadcaster. He may have the best voice of anyone who broadcasts today. Even though he retired this year, but boy, you don't forget that voice. It is far, it is high, it is deep, he said. And then, of course, at the end, Yankees win. I won't try to imitate him, but that's what he would say. And he was mega popular, like Cohen, mega popular in New York City. And I think, they understand that the importance of stories. They understand the importance of voice. They understand the importance of not trying to statistic you to death. And they would broadcast, and they would be a star in any era. Pat Hughes, the voice of the Chicago Cubs, who last year was the recipient of the Frick Award. Pat Hughes broadcast with Bob Uecker, and Bob Uecker in Milwaukee, still going strong, incidentally, 90 years old in that vicinity. Amazing. Baseball can indeed keep you young. So he, Uecker, Pat Hughes, his understudy in Milwaukee, then went to Chicago in 1996 and has owned the town since then. A wonderful broadcaster with the Chicago Cubs. Very fitting that Pat should be behind the mic in 2000, what was it, in 16, when the Cubs won the World Series. His call lives to this day. So these are some of the broadcasters. I don't wish to exclude anyone, so I will stop there. But
no, that's great.
I think that they're
yeah. So let me ask you this, though. So do you think that you have in you maybe another, maybe an updated version of this book, perhaps, that might incorporate some of those, shall we say, newer names, or maybe up-and-comers? I'll throw out one, a guy named Jason Benetti, who was, he's
yes.
not even 40, I don't think. He was with the White Sox,
right.
Now is with the Tigers. I think he is
right.
just absolutely old-school, modern, classic,
right.
In that vein
sure.
kind of thing. Do you think that there's a story there? Maybe you're not interested in doing it, or perhaps maybe you are. It almost feels like there's a generationally updated kind of vibe to your old book.
I think there is, but I'm not the one to do it.
Okay.
Because I don't follow the game as closely as I did, because certainly in terms of broadcasting, and I think there would be a place for this. I question whether it would have the same resonance as Voices of the Game. Has nothing to do with me, but rather simply because baseball is not as popular, sad to say, as it was when Voices of the Game was first issued, and the announcers are not as well known today, by and large, as they were when Voices of the Game was first issued. I look at, for example, at the first edition came out in 1989, and a paperback edition, which I'm holding in my hands, came out in 1992. I did that as well, and the updated edition, it was called. And here are the pictures of these broadcasters on the cover. Mel Allen, who there's no question had the greatest voice of any broadcaster, any baseball broadcaster who ever lived. Red Barber, Harry Carey, Curt Gowdy, and Vin Scully. Now, and this is, it pains me to say this, but these announcers today don't have the same prominence, if you would, by and large, as was the case when Voices of the Game was first issued, because baseball is not as prominent today. And it pains me to say that, but I think every fact and every statistic, every television rating would uphold my view. So I think someone could do it. I think it could be done just as well as my book, Voices of the Game, but I don't think it would have the same. I don't think it would have the same reception, simply because the position and niche of the game has changed.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I'm very deferential to that point of view. That saddens me as well. But I do, it is interesting. I mean, I do think that to me, it's fascinating when we sort of touch on topics and stuff, and teams and leagues and relocations and defunctness and all that kind of stuff, and how very irregularly, but always seemingly on time, the stories and those histories are dredged up when there's some modern occurrence, when people rush to the record books to see when the last time this happened, or do you remember the version of the, remember the Dodgers when they were in Brooklyn, which is obviously a generation. Right. And I fear, but also have hope that, maybe the broadcasting part of sports, and baseball in particular, could be, I don't know, lineally maintained, so to speak. I think of somebody like Bob Costas, somebody would like to get on this show, mostly because of his ABA.
Costas is marvelous.
Yeah, he's definitely.
He is one of the best, not something, today, although he just retired, of course, sadly, but one of the best ever. And Costas was. I remember talking to Bob for Voices of the Game, and we've been friends ever since. But no, there's no question about it. Bob has such a great sense of history as well. Very few broadcasters, in fact, none that I can think of, understand the game's lineage as well as Bob.
And I think maybe that's the crux. I think that's what you've got to, is sort of that historical, right? And I'm not saying every game has to be a history lesson, right? But I think this applies to sports generally, not, especially sports with long histories in this country. There's definitely that sort of tableau, and it saddens me when people kind of, obviously we get a little nerdy here on the, a team that lasted for 2 years, or a league that came and went.
Right.
But the notion of all that, to me, feels like that's part of the fabric of why you're here, right? The LA Dodgers, for example, just to pick a team out of thin air, I don't know why, they didn't just show up in LA one day, right? I mean, Chavez Ravine wasn't sort of built in, but there's a generation or two, or maybe three now, of fans that, they don't know nothing of the Brooklyn phenomenon and all of that stuff.
It's so sad. I mean, it's interesting. I appreciate the Dodgers. I won't say I'm a Dodgers fan in the same sense that I am a Red Sox fan. But I do wish, I don't remember the Brooklyn Dodgers. I missed by, 2 or 3 years of being old enough to remember them. I wish I did. I wish I had been of baseball consciousness to appreciate the Brooklyn Dodgers. I do, in retrospect. I think their history, bi-coastal history, in Brooklyn and Los Angeles, they're equally popular in both. They mean the same, I think, to baseball in both. They both have the same extraordinary history. The Dodgers have done a wonderful job, I think, in Los Angeles of retaining their ties to Brooklyn. And this is so important, because there's no doubt in my mind that if the Dodgers were in Brooklyn today, I would be a Brooklyn Dodgers fan as well as a Boston Red Sox fan, because they mean that much to baseball. And I truly appreciate what the Dodgers mean to baseball now. And it's so fitting that Scully, who is, again, the best there ever was the voice of the Brooklyn/Los Angeles Dodgers.
Okay,
he deserved them, and they deserved them.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I grew up in the New York area, and I inherited sort of that complex relationship with the Dodgers. But yeah, I mean, I missed that era too. Well, let me sort of throw out one last thing as we sort of corral here. We talked about history, and I kind of want to point towards your most recent book from a handful of years ago, and we kind of danced around some of this, but it is fascinating to me how your Presidents in the Pastime book kind of took
yes.
both sides, shall we say, of your, let's call it career, or at least passions and interests.
Right.
That it kind of ties that together. And why do you think the sport of baseball and the presidency, at least until fairly recently, maybe even still, were so tightly ingrained, in terms of opening day throwouts and that kind of stuff, versus, say, other sports or maybe just other events, right? What is this unique connection between the sport, at least historically, and the presidency? It's fascinating to me to see. You just go back and back and back. You said it before, they're intertwined. Why is that the case?
It's interesting. If I could, it's interesting that you mentioned the Presidents and the Pastime, which has just been re-released in paperback, in fact, this month, updated through today. I think, the presidency, of course, is the United States. I mean, I can't imagine, given our representative form of government, our belief in democracy, our belief in the three branches of government, America today would be far, far less of a nation without the presidency. It's instrumental. It's the heartbeat of the country. And I think for a long time, and to some extent today, baseball still lies deep in the bloodstream of this country. Opening day, the World Series, the All-Star game, the characters of the game. I mean, they don't lose resonance or shouldn't lose resonance because they have the temerity to die or are no longer active. We should recognize their contribution. And I like to think that enough Americans understand that to account for the sustaining relevance of baseball. I mean, I do think that that's true. You asked me if I'm the right person to do a voice of the game. No. But I'm very happy I did the Presidents in the Pastime. That's about as well as I can write. I'm sure others could write better, but that's as well as I could. That's as good as I could do, and that should be. I think any writer feels basically the same. But the characters that we're talking about, well, we all have our favorites as presidents of the United States. It's fun over a couple of gin and tonics to debate, for example, who was a greater president, John F. Kennedy or Dwight Eisenhower, or things of this ilk. In the same way that we do announcers and who the great debate of players when Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio were in their prime, the great debate was who's better. Well, Williams is the better hitter. I would say DiMaggio was the better player, overall player. That's just my view. But that's part of the beauty, of a game, that you can disagree without being disagreeable. You can have very heated debates and still remain friends. And I mentioned, for example, Mel Allen earlier. And, I remember how Jeffrey Lyon, the great film critic, said that he could make the telephone directory sound like the Sermon on the Mount. Or another critic, I remember this from memory from, I think it was Los Angeles Times, writing about Mel Allen. If Mel sold fish, he could make it sound as if Puccini wrote the score, which is a wonderful line, but I think is true. And debates like that should never lose their relevance, and they should be conducted respectfully. They should be conducted as one friend to another. And I like to think that baseball still could be one of the cores around which that kind of debate would swirl.
Well, it's also right. Probably it's the longest standing professional sport that this country is known. Right, obviously the national pastime, quote unquote.
No question about it. I mean, for so long there was baseball, period, in this country. Yes, there was boxing, there was horse racing in the 1920s and 30s, but really not until the late 50s and early 60s did pro football rival baseball in terms of popularity. So yes, baseball had the stage for a long time, a stage to itself, and I think was not as severely contested, certainly, as it is today. And baseball has to step up its game because it no longer has a stage to itself. And people today, young people particularly, kids listening to baseball, they deserve announcers who could make them feel about announcing the way that broadcasting did me when I was growing up.
All right, last question. What of the sport of baseball? And there's no question that the age, it's aging out, so to speak, and it's the
yes.
replacements, right? Not necessarily sort of coming from the youth out there.
Right.
What do you think its future is as a sport? And it's clear that there's finally some recognition that the pitch clock and that kind of stuff that has been actually quite well received, I think, by most people, even the purists out there.
Oh, I think so.
Is it too little, too late?
Yes, and I was going to say precisely that. I think you're right. It's about 10 years too late. This could have been instituted a decade ago. And yes, it's nice that it was instituted now. But what about the people what about the kids who grew up when 10 to 15 years ago, when baseball was not as scintillating, for lack of a better term, as it is today, as quickly paced as it is today? They're not suddenly going to overnight become baseball fans. So baseball has to do some very heavy thinking, which it's not doing today, in my view, about how to make itself more relevant, how to make itself more glamorous, I think, to kids who have so many other entertainment options. I think you begin and end with television and radio. There is no national coverage today from week to week and day to day as there once was with radio. There's no game of the week. There's no national television. Players are not nearly, as a result of that, not nearly as well known as they deserve to be. The same is true with network radio. There's no CBS radio game of the week as there once was. And there's no sustaining coverage. As a result, the game suffers. And I'm afraid I see this, for example, I teach at the University of Rochester. I teach English. I see this all the time. There's some kids that are interested in baseball, but not nearly enough, and not nearly what the game itself deserves.
Yeah, look, and I also think that goes hand in hand with sort of the modern permutations of media, right? I mean, there was a scarcity there back in the day, right? Well, I'm not saying it was better per se. Every niche now can be sort of delivered, and that has its pluses and minuses as well. But there were more limited options, and arguably the mantle was more secure, so to speak, for those handful of events or sports or programs or whatever, for better or for worse, right? That were more communal because there were just less choices out there. And I
remember as if it were yesterday what the World Series meant to me when I was growing up, as it had to preceding generations, as it did until recently, and how kids would take their transistor radios into school, and would listen, and we would hang on news from our if we didn't have a radio, we would hang on our friends who did. Tell me, what's the score? Has anybody homered? Is Don Newcomb still pitching, for example? Has Roger Maris homered? And we knew all the players, almost as if they were extended members of the family, an extended relative. And we knew their names, we knew their backgrounds, and that's simply not true today. And it's very painful to say that.
All right, our thanks to Curt, and you can find out more about Mr. Smith and his books on Facebook at Curt Smith Author, as well as his own website at curtsmithauthor.com. Curt is with a C, that's CURT, curtsmithauthor.com, curtsmithauthor.com, all one word. There you go. You can also find a couple of select books from Curt's various offerings on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 377 with Mr. Smith and myself, and you'll find a couple of convenient links there from those books, in particular, Voices of the Game, that acclaimed chronicle of baseball, radio, and television broadcasting, as well as the current softcover version of the reissue of The Presidents and the Pastime, the history of baseball in the White House. The convenient links there to Amazon, where if you click and purchase from said links, you will be giving us unwittingly, perhaps wittingly, a couple of shekels of referral love, which we appreciate because that helps keep our lights on and helps us, keep the tinder going for our hot stove as we await the return of baseball in a couple months, hopefully. While you're online, again, our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com, all of our episodes are posted there. But of course, the best way to get this show is to make sure that you subscribe or follow us wherever you're getting podcasts. A couple of 5-star reviews wherever you can. Doesn't hurt either. Appreciate that. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We're on various socials. On the Twitter X thing, you'll find us at goodseatsstill. And on Blue Sky, where we tend to be more active of late, you'll find us at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and various other places, from Threads to Facebook and all those other kinds of places. YouTube, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available as well. So find us there, and hopefully you'll enjoy the hot takes on the teams that don't exist anymore. That's very, very exciting. Thank you, of course, as always, to Jerry Payne for his Payne audio excellence. No pain this week, hopefully. And we appreciate your consideration of this show today, this week, and ongoing, and more to come. Stay tuned to your feeds. And again, best for the beginnings of 2025. Let's hope it's a good one for all of us, shall we? Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you next week.